Some weddings are built on love, and some are built on power, and the difference is always revealed at the altar. The Whitmore estate stretched across 12 manicured acres just outside Manhattan, its white stone facade glowing beneath a late September sun that felt carefully curated, as if even the weather had been instructed to behave. Rows of ivory roses lined the marble walkway, each bloom imported from Italy, each petal flawless, each detail orchestrated by a woman who believed perfection could erase the past. Inside the cathedral-sized ballroom, crystal chandeliers shimmered like frozen constellations, scattering light over 500 of the city's most influential guests, senators, venture capitalists, tech founders, names that filled magazine covers and boardroom directories. At the center of it all stood Ethan Whitmore, 6'2", tailored in a custom charcoal tuxedo, the polished image of a CEO who had never lost a negotiation. His jaw was steady, his posture impeccable, his expression unreadable. To the crowd, he looked like a man stepping confidently into a new chapter. Only those who knew him well would have noticed the faint tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed once before settling at his sides. Near the front row, Margaret Whitmore surveyed the room like a general inspecting a battlefield she had already won. Her pearl necklace rested against a silk navy gown, understated yet unmistakably expensive, the uniform of a woman accustomed to control. This wedding was not merely a celebration, it was a statement. Her son was marrying into legacy, into influence, into a future scrubbed clean of inconvenient history. The orchestra tuned softly, a string quartet playing something elegant and forgettable, background music for power consolidating itself. Guests murmured about market projections and foundation grants, about the brilliance of merging two dynasties. No one spoke Naomi Carter's name. Not here. Not today. Officially, she was a closed chapter, an early mistake corrected before it could tarnish the Whitmore narrative. Unofficially, her absence was the silent foundation beneath every arrangement of roses and every chilled flute of champagne waiting on silver trays. A light breeze carried the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers through the open doors, blending luxury with illusion. Margaret allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had sent the invitation 3 weeks ago with deliberate cruelty wrapped in embossed gold lettering. Let her come, she had thought. Let her see what she lost. The organ began the first low notes signaling the ceremony's approach, and guests turned toward the grand entrance where the bride would soon appear, lace train measured in feet, diamonds catching the light like promises of permanence. Ethan lifted his chin, the practiced calm of a man who had learned to compartmentalize regret. Outside the estate gates, a black town car rolled slowly down the gravel drive, tires whispering against stone. The driver stopped beneath the towering oaks that framed the entrance, their leaves just beginning to turn a deep autumn red. The rear door opened. Naomi Carter stepped out, dressed not in white, but in a deep crimson gown that moved like quiet authority in the afternoon light. On either side of her stood 2 small boys in tailored navy suits, identical down to the determined set of their brows. They held her hands as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and in a ceremony built to erase her, she walked forward with the calm certainty of a woman who had come not to beg, not to accuse, but to reveal the one truth no chandelier could outshine. The gravel crunched softly beneath Naomi Carter's heels as she walked toward the entrance, each step measured, unhurried, as if she were arriving at a board meeting rather than a ceremony designed to replace her. The twin boys at her sides matched her pace with quiet discipline, their small hands steady in hers, their navy jackets pressed sharp against their shoulders. Noah glanced up at the towering white columns ahead, his dark eyes reflecting curiosity rather than fear, while Nathan adjusted his tie the way she had shown him in the mirror that morning, chin lifted, shoulders back. They had rehearsed none of this, yet they moved with a natural dignity that could not be taught. Inside, the string quartet swelled into something triumphant, the opening notes of a processional chosen to signal the arrival of a bride who had been presented to society as the future of Whitmore legacy. Guests rose from their seats in a synchronized motion, programs rustling like controlled applause. Margaret Whitmore stood first, her expression carved from marble satisfaction, certain that every detail was unfolding precisely as she intended. Then the main doors opened again, not with the dramatic flourish reserved for the bride, but with the quiet authority of inevitability. A subtle shift rippled through the room, not loud enough to interrupt the music, yet powerful enough to change the temperature. Naomi entered as if the aisle belonged to her memory. Crimson silk caught the chandelier light and transformed it into something warmer, deeper, almost defiant. She did not search for Ethan. She did not scan the crowd. She walked forward because she had been invited, and because she had chosen to accept. The boys followed at her sides, their polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor. A few guests recognized her first, whispers blooming like sparks in dry air. Someone lowered a phone. Someone else froze mid-breath. The orchestra faltered for half a second before recovering, the musicians unsure whether this interruption was part of the script. At the altar, Ethan felt the disturbance before he understood it. His spine straightened. His heartbeat, steady until that moment, shifted into something heavier. When he turned, the world he had constructed over the past 2 years tilted on its axis. Naomi did not look like a memory. She looked like a woman who had rebuilt herself from silence. The crimson dress was not loud. It was deliberate. Her posture was calm. Her gaze was clear. For a brief, dangerous second, the noise of the room dissolved, and he saw only the woman he once stood beside in a courthouse hallway, signing papers neither of them fully understood the consequences of. Margaret moved first. Her smile tightened, pearls glinting like armor. She stepped into the aisle with measured grace, intercepting Naomi before she reached the front rows. "You have some nerve," she murmured, voice low enough to preserve appearances yet sharp enough to wound. Naomi's expression did not shift. "You sent an invitation?" she replied evenly. "I assumed you meant it." The twins stood quietly, absorbing everything with solemn awareness. Nathan's eyes drifted to the tall man at the altar. Noah followed his brother's gaze. Children often recognize familiarity long before adults admit it. The bride, still waiting at the far entrance, sensed the hesitation spreading through the room like a hairline crack in glass. Conversation stilled. Cameras lowered. Influence, money, reputation, all of it felt suddenly fragile beneath the weight of something far more human. Ethan stepped down from the altar without realizing he had moved. He stopped several feet away from Naomi, close enough to see the steadiness in her breathing, the quiet strength in the way she held their sons. Time folded in on itself. He noticed the shape of Noah's jaw, the curve of Nathan's brow, details that were impossible to ignore once seen. The orchestra's music thinned into uncertainty, notes hovering without direction. And in a room built to celebrate a new beginning, the past had walked in, dressed in crimson, carrying 2 living truths that no amount of power could dismiss. Silence has a sound when it is forced to choose sides. It settled over the ballroom now, thick and electric, pressing against crystal and silk and polished marble. Ethan stood 3 steps below the altar, his breath measured but no longer steady, his gaze fixed on the 2 boys who mirrored him in ways that logic could not explain away. Noah's chin tilted upward with the same quiet defiance Ethan had seen in his own reflection before his first boardroom battle at 28 years old. Nathan's eyes, dark and observant, held a depth that felt uncomfortably familiar. Margaret recovered first, because control had always been her greatest skill. "This is inappropriate," she announced, her voice calm but sharpened at the edges. "Today is not about revisiting old mistakes." Naomi did not flinch at the word mistake. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. Instead, she crouched gracefully beside her sons, smoothing a hand over Noah's shoulder as if they were merely guests arriving late to a garden party. "Remember what we practiced," she whispered softly. "Stand tall." The boys nodded in unison. Ethan's throat tightened. There had been no message. No call. No letter in the past 2 years that hinted at this. After the divorce, everything had ended abruptly, almost clinically. Margaret had insisted it was for the best. Naomi had signed the documents without protest. At the time, Ethan had told himself that silence meant agreement. Now he understood that silence could also mean survival. The bride at the far end of the aisle remained frozen, bouquet trembling slightly in manicured hands. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to look away or lean closer. Naomi rose again, reaching into the structured clutch at her side. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. From the small bag, She removed a cream envelope, thick and official, edges crisp. She held it not toward Margaret, but toward Ethan. "You deserve the truth," she said, her tone even, almost gentle. Margaret stepped forward sharply. "There is no truth here except desperation." Naomi met her gaze without heat. "The truth does not need desperation," she replied. Ethan took the envelope with fingers that had signed billion-dollar contracts without hesitation. His name was printed across the top of the first document in clear legal type. Beneath it were two smaller names, Noah Whitmore, Nathan Whitmore. The room seemed to tilt. The DNA results were unmistakable, percentages printed in black and white certainty. 99.9% probability of paternity. There was no scandalous accusation, no dramatic flourish, just evidence. Margaret's composure cracked by a fraction of an inch. "Tests can be manipulated," she said quickly, but the authority in her voice wavered. Naomi reached back into her bag and withdrew certified copies, notarized and stamped, along with 2 birth certificates listing Ethan as father. "Filed 18 months ago," she said quietly. "I never asked for anything. Not money. Not acknowledgement. I built what I needed on my own." Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. 18 months. He calculated without meaning to. The timing aligned with the last night before the divorce was finalized, the night when words had failed and pride had spoken louder than love. He remembered Naomi standing at the penthouse window, city lights reflected in her eyes, telling him that strength did not always look the way he expected. He had not listened. Noah stepped slightly forward, eyes fixed on Ethan. "Mom said we should meet you when you were ready," he said with childlike clarity. The innocence in his voice cut through the room more powerfully than any accusation. Margaret turned to Ethan, panic now visible beneath her polish. "Do not let this derail everything," she urged. "Think about the company. Think about what this will look like." Ethan's gaze remained on the boys. For the first time that afternoon, the chandeliers, the guests, the empire, all of it felt secondary to the simple, undeniable fact standing before him. Naomi did not demand. She did not plead. She simply stood in crimson, composed and resolute, offering him not a scandal, but a choice. And in that moment, beneath the weight of legacy and expectation, Ethan realized that power was no longer the most important thing in the room. Power does not collapse with a scream, it fractures in silence. The envelope trembled slightly in Ethan's hand, not from weakness, but from realization. The numbers on the page did not blur. They did not lie. 99.9%. The precision of science left no room for pride. Around him, the room held its breath. 500 witnesses to a moment that would not fit into any public relations strategy. Margaret stepped closer, lowering her voice to a tone meant only for her son. "This can be handled privately," she insisted. "Do not humiliate your fiancé. Do not humiliate this family." But the word family no longer sounded complete. Ethan looked at the 2 boys again, at the identical curve of their brows, at the way they stood without shrinking. They were not accidents. They were not inconveniences. They were his sons. Naomi watched him carefully, not with expectation, not with hope, but with clarity. She had not come to beg for restoration. She had come to restore truth. "You knew?" Ethan asked quietly, the question aimed at her, but heavy with everything unsaid. Naomi nodded once. "I found out 2 weeks after I signed the divorce papers," she replied. "By then your mother had already decided I was no longer suitable for your future." There was no accusation in her voice, only fact. "Why did you not tell me?" The question was almost a whisper. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, not anger, but memory. "Because you did not ask me to stay," she said. "And I will not force myself into a place where I am unwanted." The simplicity of the answer landed harder than any confrontation. Margaret's composure thinned further. "This is manipulation," she declared, addressing the guests as much as her son. "An attempt to derail an important alliance." Naomi turned slightly, enough for the crowd to see her face fully. "If I wanted to derail anything, I would have called the press," she said calmly. "I came because you invited me." The bride, pale now beneath layers of carefully applied makeup, stepped forward uncertainly. "Ethan," she began, her voice trembling, "is this true?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he lowered himself slowly to one knee, not in ceremony, but in humanity, bringing himself eye level with Noah and Nathan. "How old are you?" he asked, his tone steadying as he focused on something real. "4." Noah replied proudly. "We turned 4 in July." July. Ethan calculated again. The timeline aligned perfectly. He felt the weight of lost birthdays, missed first steps, stories never read before bed. Nathan studied him with quiet seriousness. "Mom says you build big things," he said. "Do you build families too?" The question pierced deeper than any accusation. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The empire he had spent years constructing suddenly measured against something far smaller and infinitely more significant. When he rose, he did not look at Margaret first. He looked at Naomi. "You built this alone?" he asked. She held his gaze. "I built what was necessary," she replied. "Not because I was strong, because they deserved stability." The orchestra had long since stopped playing. No one checked their phones. No one whispered now. Influence meant nothing when confronted with children asking simple truths. Margaret reached for Ethan's arm, her grip urgent. "Think about what you are risking," she pressed. "Think about the shareholders, the board, the legacy." Ethan gently removed his arm from her grasp. The gesture was small, almost invisible, yet it carried more defiance than any raised voice. "Legacy is not built on denial," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, steady and irrevocable. He turned toward the guests, toward the altar, toward the future that had been scripted for him. Then he faced Naomi again. "You did not come here for money," he said. "No," she answered. "I came so they would never have to wonder who their father is." The statement settled like truth made visible. In a ballroom designed to celebrate permanence, something else was forming, not a spectacle, not a scandal, but a reckoning. And for the first time since the ceremony began, Ethan Whitmore was no longer standing between power and expectation. He was standing between the past he had allowed and the responsibility he could no longer ignore. The room did not erupt into chaos. It shifted into something heavier, more deliberate, as if every person present understood that history was being rewritten in real time. Ethan stood in the center of it, the weight of generations pressing against his shoulders, yet for the first time the pressure did not come from investors or board members. It came from 2 small boys waiting for him to decide who he would be. Margaret's voice, once commanding, now carried an edge of disbelief. "You cannot dismantle everything for a sudden revelation," she insisted. "There are contracts signed. There are expectations." Ethan turned slowly toward her, not with anger, but with clarity that felt unfamiliar even to him. "They are not a revelation," he said evenly. "They are my sons." The statement was quiet, but it carried farther than the orchestra ever had. The bride lowered her bouquet completely now, petals brushing the polished floor. The illusion of perfection had thinned beyond repair. Naomi remained composed, her posture unshaken, crimson fabric catching the light like controlled fire. She had delivered the truth. What Ethan chose to do with it was no longer within her control. Noah squeezed her hand gently, sensing the tension without fully understanding its architecture. Nathan kept his eyes on Ethan, patient in a way that did not belong to a 4-year-old. Ethan took a slow breath, the kind he used before announcing mergers that reshaped industries. Except this decision was not about acquisition. It was about accountability. He walked back toward the altar, not to resume the ceremony, but to end the pretense. Facing the guests, he spoke without raising his voice. "I built my career on responsibility," he said. "I do not walk away from what is mine." A murmur traveled through the room, not scandalized but stunned. Margaret's hand trembled slightly against her pearl necklace. "You are making an emotional mistake," she whispered sharply. Ethan shook his head once. "No," he replied. "I made that mistake 2 years ago." He turned toward the bride, whose eyes shimmered not with anger, but with wounded realization. "You deserve honesty," he told her. "And I cannot stand here and promise you a future while denying my past." The bride nodded slowly, dignity returning to her posture. Without drama, she stepped aside, releasing him from a union that had already lost its foundation. The guests watched as influence bent under something far more human. Ethan descended the steps again, this time with intention, stopping directly in front of Noah and Nathan. He crouched once more, meeting their gaze. "I did not know," he said simply. "But I should have." It was not an excuse. It was an admission. He extended his hand, hesitant yet sincere. Noah looked at Naomi first. She gave a small nod, permission without pressure. The boy placed his hand into Ethan's palm. Nathan followed, more cautious, but steady. The contact was not ceremonial. It was fragile and real. Margaret exhaled sharply, as if witnessing the collapse of a carefully engineered dynasty. But what she failed to see was that legacy was not ending. It was evolving. Naomi stepped back half a pace, allowing space for something she had never demanded. She had built stability without him. She would continue with or without his participation. Ethan rose, still holding the boy's hands, and faced the crowd one final time. "This ceremony will not continue," he announced calmly. "My responsibility begins now." There were no dramatic exits, no raised voices, no shattered glass. Only a shift in gravity. The chandeliers still glowed. The roses still lined the aisle. Yet the power dynamic had changed. Naomi had entered as a reminder. She now stood as proof that dignity does not beg for recognition. It waits for truth. And as Ethan walked beside his sons down the aisle that had been prepared for another future, the world Margaret had so carefully curated did not shatter in noise. It unraveled in silence, replaced by something smaller, quieter, and infinitely stronger. Outside the grand doors of the Whitmore estate, the late afternoon sun had shifted into a deeper gold, stretching long shadows across the 12 acres of immaculate lawn as if the world itself were exhaling after holding its breath too long. The air felt different beyond the marble and crystal, cooler, honest. Guests remained frozen inside, murmuring in cautious tones. But out here there were no chandeliers, no orchestrated expectations, only gravel beneath polished shoes and the faint rustle of early autumn leaves. Ethan walked beside Noah and Nathan down the wide stone steps, his stride no longer rehearsed but uncertain in a way that felt strangely grounding. For years he had moved with calculated precision, each decision backed by analysts and attorneys. Now he was navigating something that did not come with a briefing document. Naomi followed a few steps behind, not chasing, not guiding, simply allowing the moment to unfold without interference. She had not come to reclaim a husband. She had come to correct a narrative. At the base of the steps, Ethan slowed and turned to face the boys fully, kneeling once more so that his height did not overshadow theirs. "I cannot change what I did not know," he said carefully, choosing each word the way he once chose clauses in contracts. "But I can choose what I do next." Noah studied him with open curiosity. "Are you coming with us?" he asked, the question simple and devastating in its clarity. Ethan glanced up at Naomi, searching her expression for permission, for resistance, for anything that might guide him. She offered neither. Her gaze remained calm, almost neutral. "That depends on what coming means," she replied evenly. "They have a home. They have stability. I will not let confusion disrupt that." There was no accusation in her tone, only boundaries built from experience. Ethan stood slowly, brushing a hand across his jacket as if shedding the last fragments of ceremony. "Where do you live?" he asked, not as a demand, but as an invitation into a life he had missed. "Brooklyn," Naomi answered. "A brownstone 3 blocks from their school. 10-minute walk. 12 if they stop to look at every dog on the sidewalk." The faintest smile touched Noah's face at that detail. Ethan absorbed it all, the geography of a world that had grown without him. Margaret's voice drifted faintly from the doorway behind them, sharp and strained, calling his name. He did not turn. For the first time in his life, the sound of his mother's authority did not dictate his movement. Instead, he focused on the 2 small hands that had trusted him enough to hold on. "I would like to see where you live," he said gently, "if that is allowed." Naomi considered him for a long moment, measuring not his wealth, but his willingness. "You can visit," she said finally, "but you will not disrupt their routine. They wake up at 7. School starts at 8:30. Bedtime is 8 sharp." Ethan nodded, the specifics landing heavier than any corporate deadline. "Understood." A sleek black car waited near the drive, the same one that had brought Naomi here. The driver stepped forward silently, opening the rear door. Naomi gestured for the boys to climb in first. They did, adjusting their small suit jackets with practiced care. Ethan hesitated, looking back once at the estate where an empire still stood intact, but altered. Inside, the reception hall shimmered untouched, yet its meaning had shifted permanently. Margaret remained framed in the doorway, her silhouette rigid against the fading light. She had spent decades protecting a legacy defined by image. She had never considered that image could survive honesty. Ethan turned away from the estate and stepped toward the car, not as a groom leaving a canceled ceremony, but as a father stepping into accountability. Naomi watched him carefully as he settled into the seat beside Noah and Nathan, not touching them yet, but present. The door closed with a quiet finality. As the car pulled down the long gravel drive and onto the open road, the estate receded behind them, still grand, still powerful, but no longer the center of gravity. For the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore was not driving toward a merger or a market expansion. He was driving toward a small brownstone in Brooklyn, toward bedtime routines and school lunches, toward conversations that would not fit inside boardroom walls. And in that simple direction, something far greater than a wedding had ended. Something far more enduring had begun. The drive from the Whitmore estate to Brooklyn took just under 40 minutes, but for Ethan it felt like crossing a border he had never noticed before. The skyline shifted as the car moved east, glass towers giving way to brick facades and tree-lined streets where life unfolded without press releases or curated guest lists. Noah and Nathan sat on either side of him in the back seat, their earlier composure softening into the natural restlessness of 4-year-olds. Noah pressed his forehead lightly against the window, counting yellow taxis as they passed. Nathan leaned toward Ethan, studying his cuff links with quiet fascination. "Do you always dress like that?" Nathan asked. Ethan glanced down at the charcoal tuxedo that now felt out of place. "Not always," he answered honestly. "Mostly for important meetings." Noah turned from the window. Was today important? The question lingered. Ethan considered it carefully. "It was supposed to be," he said. "But I think this is more important." The boys accepted the answer without analysis. Their world defined less by ceremony and more by presence. Naomi watched the exchange from the opposite seat, her expression thoughtful but guarded. She had learned not to confuse a single decision with transformation. The car turned onto a quieter street lined with brownstones in shades of red and deep brown, each stoop decorated with potted plants and chalk drawings fading from the afternoon sun. The driver slowed in front of a 3-story building, with black iron railings and tall windows framed by white trim. "Home," Noah announced with quiet pride. Ethan stepped out first this time, instinctively moving to open the door for the boys. The air carried the scent of nearby bakeries and distant traffic, ordinary and grounding. Naomi unlocked the front door and ushered them inside. The interior was warm without being extravagant, hardwood floors softened by patterned rugs, shelves lined with children's books and framed photos. Ethan's gaze lingered on one particular photograph displayed near the staircase. Naomi sat on a park bench, sunlight catching her hair, Noah and Nathan on either side of her holding melting ice cream cones. The joy in the image was unfiltered. He had not been there. "Shoes off," Nathan reminded him, already slipping out of his polished pair. Ethan complied without hesitation, placing his expensive shoes neatly beside a row of smaller sneakers. The gesture felt symbolic in ways he did not articulate. Naomi moved toward the kitchen, setting her clutch on the counter. "Dinner is simple," she said evenly. "Grilled chicken, brown rice, broccoli. They do not negotiate vegetables." Noah giggled at that. Ethan followed the boys into the living room, where toy trucks were arranged in precise lines across a low table. "Do you build things with these?" he asked. "Cities," Noah corrected proudly. "We build cities." Ethan crouched beside them, studying the miniature skyline constructed from plastic blocks. It was uneven, imperfect, but earnest. "May I help?" he asked. Nathan handed him a block without ceremony. For several minutes, the only sound was the quiet click of pieces connecting. No applause, no contracts, just small hands and tentative collaboration. Naomi observed from the doorway, arms crossed loosely, not in defense, but in reflection. She had built this environment deliberately, measured in routines and stability. She would not allow sudden enthusiasm to disrupt it. "Bedtime is still 8, she reminded gently. Ethan nodded, checking the time on his phone and realizing how rarely he had structured his life around anything other than quarterly reports. As the evening light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not triumph. Not regret alone. Responsibility. the kind that did not depend on public recognition. When Noah leaned against his arm without hesitation, the contact was small but seismic. This house was not grand. It did not stretch across 12 acres or host 500 guests. Yet within its narrow walls lived something his estate had never contained: continuity. And as Naomi set 3 small plates on the kitchen table, she understood that the real test would not be whether Ethan could walk away from power. It would be whether he could return tomorrow, and the day after that, and every ordinary evening that followed. The first evening did not feel like a dramatic reunion. It felt like something far more fragile. After dinner, plates rinsed and stacked neatly in the dishwasher, Noah and Nathan carried their favorite books into the living room, each choosing one with serious deliberation. "We read before bed," Noah explained, as though outlining a policy. 2 stories, not 3. Nathan nodded. 3 is only on Fridays. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, jacket folded beside him, sleeves rolled carefully to his forearms as if preparing for a negotiation that required humility instead of leverage. Naomi dimmed the overhead lights, leaving only a warm lamp glowing near the bookshelf. The house shifted into a softer rhythm. "You can read," Noah told Ethan, handing him a worn copy of a picture book about a bear who builds a treehouse. The corners were bent, pages slightly wrinkled from repetition. Ethan took it with cautious reverence, clearing his throat before beginning. His voice, accustomed to commanding conference rooms, adjusted to a gentler cadence. He stumbled once over an exaggerated character voice, and both boys laughed without cruelty, only delight. Naomi leaned against the doorway, arms loosely crossed, watching as the distance between past and present narrowed by inches instead of miles. When the second story ended, Nathan yawned dramatically, signaling the end of negotiation. 8 o'clock, he announced proudly, glancing toward the small digital clock on the wall. Naomi guided them upstairs, Ethan following a step behind, absorbing the creak of wooden stairs, the framed artwork taped slightly crooked along the hallway. The bedroom was shared but thoughtfully arranged, 2 twin beds separated by a small nightstand, glow-in-the-dark stars scattered across the ceiling. "We say goodnight in order," Noah explained, sliding beneath his blanket. "Mom first." Naomi kissed each forehead gently, smoothing blankets with practiced hands. Then both boys looked at Ethan expectantly. The moment was simple and enormous. Ethan hesitated only a fraction before stepping forward. He knelt beside Noah's bed first. "Good night," he said softly. Noah studied him. "Will you come tomorrow?" he asked, the question barely above a whisper. Ethan met his eyes. "Yes," he answered, not as a promise shaped by optimism, but as a commitment shaped by choice. He repeated the ritual at Nathan's bedside, receiving a small, tentative hug in return. The contact was brief but sincere. When the bedroom lights were switched off and the door left slightly ajar, Naomi descended the stairs with measured calm. Ethan followed, stopping in the quiet living room where the city's distant hum filtered through tall windows. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not hostile. It was evaluative. "They adjust quickly," Ethan said finally, his voice low. Naomi shook her head slightly. "They observe quickly," she corrected. "Adjustment takes consistency." He absorbed the distinction. "I do not expect forgiveness," he said. "From you or from them." Naomi met his gaze without softness and without bitterness. "Forgiveness is not the currency here," she replied. "Stability is." The words settled between them like a contract more binding than any legal document. Ethan nodded once. "Then I will start there." Outside, a siren wailed faintly in the distance, life continuing without regard for boardrooms or broken ceremonies. Ethan glanced around the modest but warm room, at the photographs, the toys, the evidence of years lived without him. "You built something strong," he admitted quietly. Naomi's expression did not change, but her eyes flickered with acknowledgement. "I built what was necessary," she repeated, echoing earlier truth. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 9. Ethan reached for his folded jacket, preparing to leave for the night. Responsibility did not demand immediate relocation. It demanded return. At the door he paused. "Tomorrow," he said again, more to himself than to her. Naomi opened the door without ceremony. 7:30, she reminded. "They eat breakfast at 7:45. Ethan stepped out onto the stoop, the Brooklyn air cool against his face, and for the first time in years, his calendar felt less important than a morning alarm set for something real. Inside, Naomi locked the door gently, not shutting him out, but ensuring that if he came back, it would be by deliberate choice. And upstairs, beneath glow-in-the-dark stars, two boys fell asleep with a new possibility woven quietly into their dreams. At 7:30 the next morning, the alarm on Ethan's phone rang before the sun had fully risen over Manhattan, and for the first time in years he did not reach to silence it and return to sleep. He had barely slept at all. The events of the previous day had replayed in fragments, not as scandal, but as realization. By 7:40, he was dressed in a simple navy sweater and dark jeans instead of a tailored suit, standing on the Brooklyn sidewalk with two paper bags from a corner bakery balanced carefully in his hands. The brownstone door opened at exactly 7:45. Naomi stood there, already composed, dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored slacks, her hair pulled back neatly. She did not look surprised. She looked observant. "You are early," she noted calmly. "Traffic was lighter than expected," he replied, aware that punctuality meant more here than presentation ever had at his estate. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread. Noah and Nathan sat at the small wooden table, legs swinging slightly above the floor, bowls of oatmeal half finished. Their eyes widened when they saw him. "You came," Noah said, as if testing the consistency of a promise. "I said I would," Ethan answered, placing the paper bags on the counter. "I brought blueberry muffins." "I checked. No nuts." Naomi's eyebrow lifted almost imperceptibly. "They cannot have nuts," she confirmed. "I asked," he said simply. The boys exchanged a look of quiet approval. After breakfast, backpacks were zipped, jackets tugged on, shoelaces double-knotted. Ethan found himself crouched on the narrow entryway rug, tying Nathan's laces more carefully than any contract he had signed. The walk to school was exactly 10 minutes, just as Naomi had said, though Noah paused twice to point out a golden retriever and a construction crane towering above a new apartment building. Ethan listened to each observation as if it were a quarterly report he could not afford to ignore. At the school gate, other parents greeted Naomi warmly. Their conversations centered on field trips and spelling tests rather than stock prices. A few curious glances flickered toward Ethan, recognition dawning slowly, but no one commented. This was not the Whitmore estate. Influence did not echo as loudly here. When the boys disappeared inside, waving briefly before turning toward their classroom, Ethan felt the quiet weight of separation that most parents experience daily. It was not dramatic. It was steady. Naomi stood beside him, arms folded loosely against the morning chill. "You do not have to prove anything in a week," she said without looking at him. "Consistency is measured in months, in years." He nodded. "I am not looking for applause," he replied. "I am looking for a chance." She turned to meet his gaze fully. "A chance requires humility," she said. "Not control." The words landed cleanly. He did not defend himself. Instead, he walked with her back toward the brownstone, matching her pace rather than leading. By 9:30, he was on a conference call from her small dining table, laptop open but voice quieter than usual. News of the canceled ceremony had already begun circulating across financial networks. Headlines questioned his stability. Analysts speculated about board reactions. Margaret had left 3 messages overnight. He silenced his phone and continued listening to a regional manager discuss quarterly projections, but his attention divided differently now. Through the window, he could see the street below, ordinary life moving without regard for corporate turbulence. When the call ended, he closed the laptop deliberately. "I will need to address the board," he said. Naomi poured a second cup of coffee, without ceremony. "Then address them," she replied. "But do not let them dictate whether you show up at 3:15. He glanced at the clock on the wall, memorizing the number. 3:15. School dismissal. The market would still open tomorrow. Investors would still calculate risk. But 2 boys would walk out of a brick building expecting to see whether yesterday had been temporary or permanent. Ethan understood then that leadership did not begin in a ballroom or a boardroom. It began on a sidewalk in Brooklyn, at 3:15 in the afternoon, with a decision to remain present when it would be easier to retreat. And as Naomi gathered her work bag, preparing for her own day, she allowed herself one private acknowledgement. He had returned. Now the real measure would be whether he continued. At 3:15 that afternoon, the school doors opened with the ordinary rush of children spilling onto the sidewalk, backpacks bouncing, voices rising in bright, unfiltered chaos. Ethan stood just outside the iron gate, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, resisting the instinct to check his phone for market updates. That had undoubtedly intensified since morning. He had spent the late morning at Whitmore Group headquarters, facing a boardroom filled with directors who measured risk in percentages and headlines. They had questioned his judgment, his timing, his public image. He had listened without interruption, then spoken without apology. "I am not stepping down," he had said calmly. "And I am not denying my sons." The statement had unsettled the room more than any financial forecast. Now, standing among parents holding coffee cups and checking homework folders, the gravity of that declaration felt clearer. This was the audience that mattered. When Noah emerged first, scanning the crowd with alert focus, his face lit with unmistakable relief. "You are here," he called out, jogging the last few steps. Nathan followed closely behind, gripping a sheet of construction paper decorated with uneven crayon stars. Ethan crouched instinctively, arms open, catching them both in an embrace that was brief but real. "I said I would be," he replied, aware that repetition was the foundation of trust. Naomi arrived moments later, her pace steady, her eyes evaluating without comment. She had left her own office early, rearranging meetings with quiet efficiency. The four of them walked home together, Noah describing a math lesson with dramatic emphasis, while Nathan insisted that his drawing deserved a place on the refrigerator. Ethan listened to every detail as though absorbing a language he should have learned years ago. At the brownstone, shoes were removed again, backpacks placed neatly by the door. Ethan knelt to examine Nathan's drawing, tracing the outline of a tall stick figure beside two smaller ones. "Is that us?" he asked gently. Nathan nodded. "You are the tall one," he explained. "But Mom is in the middle." Ethan glanced at Naomi, who was already setting apple slices on a plate. She did not smile, but she did not look away either. Later that evening, while the boys completed simple worksheets at the kitchen table, Ethan's phone buzzed repeatedly across the counter. Margaret's name flashed again. This time he answered. "You are dismantling everything your father built," she said sharply, her voice tight with restrained outrage. Ethan looked at Noah's bent head over a pencil, at Nathan counting carefully on his fingers. "No," he replied evenly. "I am correcting what I failed to build." There was silence on the other end. "The shareholders will not tolerate instability." She pressed. "They will," he said calmly. "Because I will not allow instability." He ended the call without escalation, setting the phone face down. Naomi watched him quietly. "She will not stop," she said. "Neither will I," he answered, not with defiance, but with resolve. When 8 o'clock approached, bedtime rituals resumed. This time Ethan did not hesitate before reading, his voice more natural, less cautious. After the lights were dimmed and the boys settled beneath their blankets, he stepped into the hallway where Naomi waited. "Tomorrow I will bring them to school," he said. It was not a question. Naomi considered him carefully, measuring tone, not words. 7:30, she reminded once more. He nodded. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, headlines still circulating, analysts still speculating about Whitmore Group's future. Yet inside the narrow brownstone, something steadier was taking shape. Influence had shifted from spectacle to presence. And as Ethan stood in the quiet hallway beneath faint glow and the dark stars, he understood that leadership did not require a stage. It required return. Tomorrow at 7:30. And every morning after that. By the end of the week, the headlines had evolved from speculation to scrutiny. Financial anchors debated Whitmore Group's stability. Analysts questioned succession planning, and anonymous sources hinted at board tension. Yet every morning at 7:30, Ethan stood on the narrow Brooklyn sidewalk with two small backpacks in hand, adjusting straps and reminding Noah not to forget his library book. The contrast between cable news urgency and school day routine felt almost surreal. Inside the brownstone, Naomi moved with quiet efficiency, her own schedule recalibrated but never disrupted. She watched patterns, not performances. Ethan had arrived every day. He had stayed through homework. He had listened more than he spoke. Consistency was beginning to replace shock. On Friday afternoon, as they returned from school, a black sedan idled at the corner of the block, polished and unmistakably out of place among compact cars and delivery vans. Margaret Whitmore stepped out, dressed in tailored gray, posture flawless, expression controlled. She had not called ahead. Naomi paused mid-step, her hand resting lightly on Nathan's shoulder. Ethan saw his mother before she spoke, and for a brief moment, the old reflex to brace himself returned. Margaret approached without acknowledging the boys. "We need to talk," she said crisply, her gaze fixed on her son. "About what?" Ethan asked evenly. "About the damage you are causing," she replied. "Investors are uneasy. The board is considering contingency plans. You are risking decades of work for sentiment." Noah tightened his grip on Ethan's hand instinctively. Margaret's eyes flickered toward the movement, then quickly away. Naomi did not step back. "This is not the place," she said calmly. Margaret's chin lifted slightly. "On the contrary," she answered, her voice lowering but no less sharp. "This is precisely the place. You have inserted yourself into a narrative that was resolved." Naomi met her gaze without heat. "I did not insert myself," she said. "You invited me." The truth hung between them, clean and unembellished. Ethan stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between his mother and the boys without theatrics. "This conversation will not happen in front of them," he said. Margaret exhaled slowly, as though adjusting strategy. "Very well," she replied. "Walk with me." Naomi knelt briefly beside Noah and Nathan. "Inside," she said gently. "Homework first." The boys obeyed, though their eyes lingered with concern. Once the door closed behind them, Ethan faced his mother on the quiet sidewalk. "You built an empire," Margaret began, her tone shifting from command to persuasion. "Your father trusted you to protect it." Ethan nodded once. "And I will," he said, "but not by pretending my sons do not exist." Margaret's composure thinned. "You do not understand how perception works," she insisted. "Weakness invites challenge." Ethan's voice remained steady. "Acknowledging responsibility is not weakness." For a moment, something softer flickered beneath Margaret's rigid exterior. "You are allowing her to control the narrative," she said, quieter now. "She is not controlling anything," he replied. "She is protecting her children. I am choosing to protect them as well." The distinction settled heavily. Margaret looked toward the brownstone windows, where faint shadows moved behind curtains. "If you continue down this path, you may lose your position," she warned. Ethan held her gaze without aggression. "Then I will build something else," he answered simply. The statement carried no bravado, only resolve. Margaret studied him as though seeing a version of her son she had not anticipated. "You sound like your father," she said finally. Ethan allowed a faint, almost sad smile. "He taught me about legacy," he replied. "I am expanding the definition." Margaret did not respond. She turned toward the waiting sedan, posture still immaculate, but her stride slightly less certain. As the car disappeared down the block, Ethan remained on the sidewalk for a long moment, absorbing the quiet. Inside the brownstone, crayons scraped against paper, and Naomi's voice drifted softly from the kitchen. He understood now that this was not a rebellion. It was a recalibration. And when he stepped back through the front door, greeted by two small faces eager to show him spelling words written in careful pencil, he knew that whatever he risked in boardrooms, he had already gained something far more enduring. The following Monday, the board meeting convened at 9 o'clock sharp on the 50th floor of Whitmore Group headquarters, glass walls reflecting a skyline that had watched Ethan rise from ambitious heir to decisive leader. This time, however, the atmosphere carried a different current. Directors sat in a long row of leather chairs, tablets open, expressions composed but watchful. News of Margaret's visit to Brooklyn had circulated privately among senior executives, and speculation had deepened. Ethan entered without ceremony, dressed in a tailored navy suit that felt less like armor and more like uniform. He did not reference headlines. He did not defend emotion. He began with numbers: quarterly performance, cash flow stability, long-term strategy. His voice remained steady, measured, precise. When he finished, the chairman cleared his throat. "The market reaction to recent personal developments has been volatile," he said carefully. "We must consider perception." Ethan folded his hands calmly on the polished table. "Perception adjusts to consistency," he replied. "Our fundamentals remain strong. My leadership remains stable. and my acknowledgement of my children does not compromise shareholder value. A murmur rippled lightly through the room. One director leaned forward. There are concerns about distraction. Ethan met his gaze directly. Distraction occurs when issues are hidden, he answered. Transparency eliminates it. Silence followed, not hostile but contemplative. For the first time since the wedding, the narrative was shifting from scandal to structure. Outside the building, cameras still lingered, but the frenzy had softened into curiosity. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Naomi walked Noah and Nathan to school as usual, the rhythm of routine intact. Parents whispered less now. Some offered tentative smiles. The world had not collapsed. It had recalibrated. That afternoon, when Ethan arrived at 3:15 as promised, a few reporters stood across the street, lenses lowered but attentive. He did not wave. He did not comment. He simply waited by the gate like every other parent. When Noah ran toward him, grinning, the cameras captured not drama but ordinariness. Nathan held up a gold star sticker proudly. Perfect spelling, he announced. Ethan knelt without self-consciousness. I am impressed, he said sincerely. The next day, Whitmore Group stock steadied. Analysts cited strong fundamentals. Commentary shifted toward strategic resilience. Margaret watched the numbers from her office, expression unreadable. She had expected fracture. Instead, she saw adaptation. That evening, she appeared once more at the Brooklyn brownstone, this time without a sedan idling theatrically at the curb. She rang the bell. Naomi opened the door, posture calm. Margaret's gaze moved past her to where the boys sat on the living room floor building another block city. May I come in? She asked, the request quiet but unmistakably deliberate. Naomi stepped aside without commentary. Margaret removed her gloves slowly, observing the modest but warm space. I did not anticipate this outcome, she admitted, her voice lower than before. Ethan stood beside the staircase, attentive but not defensive. Neither did I, he replied. Margaret watched Noah stack a final block carefully atop his structure. Your father believed legacy required control, she said softly. Perhaps he was incomplete. The admission was subtle, but seismic. Naomi met her eyes evenly. Legacy also requires presence, she said. Margaret nodded once, the motion small but genuine. She approached the boys cautiously. You build cities? She asked. Noah studied her, then handed her a single block. You can help, he said matter-of-factly. Margaret hesitated only a second before kneeling, placing the block where Noah directed. The gesture was not grand. It was unfamiliar. And in that quiet living room, beneath ordinary light instead of crystal chandeliers, the shape of legacy shifted again. Not through dominance, through acknowledgement. As evening settled over Brooklyn, the city's noise softened into background hum. And for the first time, 3 generations occupied the same room, without spectacle. The empire still stood in Manhattan, but its center had moved, recalibrated by something smaller, steadier, and infinitely more enduring. Legacy is not what you protect in public. It is what you practice in private. Weeks passed, then months, and the spectacle that once threatened to define them faded into routine. Whitmore Group stabilized not because headlines softened, but because leadership remained consistent. Ethan attended every board meeting with the same composure he had always carried, yet he left each one on time, no longer lingering for optics or after-dinner negotiations. 3:15 was no longer flexible. It was fixed. In Brooklyn, the brownstone settled into a new rhythm. Margaret's visits became less formal, her tailored suits replaced occasionally by a softer cardigan, her pearls exchanged for something simpler. She did not attempt to control the boys. She observed them. She listened. The first time Noah asked her to read a story, she hesitated only long enough to adjust her glasses. Her voice was precise, each word articulated carefully, as if even bedtime required dignity. Nathan corrected her once when she skipped a line, and instead of bristling, she smiled faintly and began again. Naomi watched these moments without interference. She did not forget the past, but she did not weaponize it either. Forgiveness had never been a performance. It was a decision measured quietly over time. One crisp Saturday afternoon, nearly 6 months after the wedding that never happened, the family gathered in Prospect Park beneath a wide oak tree whose leaves were turning the same deep red as the dress Naomi had worn that day. Noah and Nathan raced across the grass, sneakers pounding against earth, laughter unfiltered and bright. Ethan stood beside Naomi, hands in his coat pockets, watching their sons argue about whose turn it was to fly the small kite tugging against the autumn wind. "You did not have to let me back in," he said softly, his tone reflective rather than pleading. Naomi kept her eyes on the boys. "I did not let you back in," she replied calmly. "You chose to stay. The distinction mattered." He nodded once. "I almost lost everything," he admitted. Naomi turned slightly toward him, sunlight catching the edge of her profile. "You lost an illusion," she said. "You gained reality." Across the lawn, Margaret sat on a bench, a thermos of tea beside her, observing her grandsons with a gaze no longer defined by calculation. When Noah stumbled and regained his balance without tears, she clapped once in restrained encouragement. The gesture was small, but genuine. Ethan followed Naomi's gaze toward his mother. "She is trying," he said. Naomi inclined her head slightly. "So are you." The wind lifted the kite higher, its string pulled taut in Nathan's determined grip. "Look," he shouted. "It is not falling." Ethan smiled, stepping forward to steady the line. "Hold it firm," he instructed gently. "Not too tight." The lesson applied beyond the park. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the grass, the four of them walked toward the park exit together, Margaret following a few steps behind. There were no cameras, no analysts, no orchestrated applause, just the sound of leaves underfoot and the steady rhythm of shared steps. That evening, back at the brownstone, the refrigerator held drawings layered over one another, evidence of days stacked carefully instead of dramatically. Naomi prepared dinner while Ethan set the table without being asked. Noah recited a new spelling word. Nathan insisted that the kite should have its own place by the window. Margaret folded napkins with meticulous care, no longer directing, simply participating. The empire in Manhattan still stood tall, its glass reflecting the skyline as it always had. But its definition had shifted. It was no longer measured solely in market capitalization or influence. It was measured in mornings kept, in promises repeated, in the quiet endurance of presence. And as bedtime settled over the narrow brownstone, glow-in-the-dark stars illuminating the ceiling once more, Ethan understood something he had once overlooked. Power can command attention, but only responsibility commands respect. Naomi turned off the lamp and paused at the doorway, watching two small figures drift toward sleep, secure in something that could not be bought or orchestrated. Outside, the city hummed as it always had. Inside, legacy rested peacefully, no longer guarded by control, but sustained by choice.